Socialism links tightly to lying. I would not have thought that not that long ago. But in studying this, it's been somewhat surprising. The past 3 weeks, of course, we've been discussing socialism and the Bible. There are many who think that socialism is somehow Christian. It is not. We talked about that it's actually quite antithetical. It begins with the premise that private property will ultimately be eliminated. Well, all of the basics of the scripture in terms of your actions of love and such are dependent upon you having something with which you can be generous, whether it's your time or your money or whatever. It's not Christian. There are various flavors: Marxism, National Socialism, Fascism, Democratic Socialism. And in the past weeks, we've talked about how some of those, which are presumed to not be leftist, if you will, like Nazism, are in fact forms of socialism. They may differ on who owns the means of production, but they don't differ on who controls everything, and that is the state. All share a methodology that depends on deception and intentional prevarication, and we'll be discussing this today. You may recall that Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate asked, "What is truth?" Critical question. What is truth? How do you determine the truth? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Basically, how do you know what you know? Well, we now live in a world where the truth is quite elusive. It can be very hard to find. And we're discovering that there are people who are intentionally modifying videos, audio tracks, and the rest so that it becomes almost impossible to know the truth. But there are some methods that can be used, biblical methods. We'll talk about that. Now, I've done business around the world now for some years, actually almost 35 years, flying all over the place. And I was struck as I traveled that most of the world is cash-based. Oh, there may be some credit, but the core of the society is cash-based. Ultimately, my conclusion was the reason that is there is no trust. And so you have to use cash. The word credit comes from the Latin word credito, which means to trust. And so if you don't trust somebody, you don't give them any credit. You don't give them a loan. You don't do any of that. It makes it much more difficult for society to develop, for the economics to develop, and the rest. And it was a surprise to me, because from the time I was a little boy, and I suspect the same for all of you, I was taught that it's absolutely vital to tell the truth. Telling the truth used to be as American as mom and apple pie. Even those things seem to be changing. Every school kid was taught that George Washington never told a lie. I did not. No, he didn't say that. He said, I did. I cut down that cherry tree. The little boy who would not tell a lie. Every child also learned the 10 Commandments in school. That's all changed. It's almost impossible, especially as you are watching the news, to be certain if anyone is telling the truth. Lying has become an accepted way of life. If you couple lying with the megaphone of social media and the news, you have a very volatile combination. It is lying on steroids. The 9th Commandment used to be part of every American child's training. No longer. And clearly it seems that for many on the news, they never heard this commandment. What people think the 9th Commandment says is, thou shalt not lie. That is not what it says. What it actually says is actually more critical. It says, if you read the King James, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. NIV, more recent version of the scriptures, more recent translation, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. That's critical, because if you're going to build a society, you need to have trust at its heart. You need to have honesty, integrity, base items like that. God himself does not lie. It is impossible for God to tell a lie, we read in Titus 1:8. When Jesus spoke, he spoke the truth. In fact, he spoke differently than the prophets of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the prophets would speak and say, "Thus saith the Lord." They were speaking for someone else. They were speaking on behalf of the Lord. Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say unto you," or "This is the truth, this is the truth, I say unto you." Older translations, "Verily, verily, this is the truth." He spoke himself. He wasn't speaking on behalf of God. He was God, and he spoke. Truth is communicated through words. It's communicated through pictures. It's communicated various ways. But we live in an age when the means of doing that, the means of transmitting a message, has been changed forever by technology. I should pull out my phone and say, "Hey Siri, how old is Joe Namath?" And it will come back and say, "Joe Namath is 76 years old." Trust me on this. You're going to check me out. You can go to Snopes. Actually, we'll talk about Snopes later. Okay, now I'll believe Siri, right? People go into Google. They'll believe Google. But maybe I shouldn't believe Siri. Maybe I shouldn't believe Google. Maybe some of the core data is wrong. Maybe it's been influenced. Maybe there are people who had thoughts that it shouldn't say this, it should say something else. Well, with Joe Namath's age, I'll guarantee you he's 76. Okay, I watched him when he was a young man. He's 76. But the means of communication have changed. Until yesterday, the pen was mightier than the sword, and newspapers were vital in our nation. But yesterday, Warren Buffett sold his last newspaper holding, something he said he would never do. And today, social media is mightier than the sword. But who can be certain that what they read, see, or hear is the truth, whether it's on social media, on television, in the paper, or in an email that you receive from a friend? Well, the struggle gets more complex because there is an adversary, an enemy. In fact, the name Satan translates to adversary. It's a title of the one who, as close as we get to a given name, is called Lucifer. Now, Lucifer is an interesting name because it means light bearer. He is described in Genesis as the most beautiful of God's creation. And you know, a lie can be really beautiful and can make things look beautiful that are pretty crummy. And just as God is the source of truth, Satan is the father of lies. And Jesus said this to the hypocrites. By the way, a hypocrite is somebody who is lying with his whole life. He is misrepresenting who he is and what he does and how he believes. Jesus said to the hypocrites, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. And when he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies." That's in John chapter 8. Well, we live in a time of lies and false witnesses. Your eyes and your ears can deceive you. In the words of Chico Marx, in that great movie, Duck Soup, who are you going to believe? Me or your lion eyes? Hey, we have Photoshop pictures. We have now deep fakes. A deep fake is a faked video that is so good that the person who is in it is speaking and acting and doing everything in such a way that you cannot easily tell that that person didn't do it. You could have a presidential candidate change parties in front of the whole world in a deep fake. You could have someone tell the biggest lie in front of a deep fake. You could have a deep fake that goes back and takes something that someone said 20 years ago and changes it so that it does not contradict what they're saying today. In other words, you can change the past. You can change the present. But it doesn't have to be that elaborate. It doesn't have to be that high tech. It can just be what is included in what is communicated to you and what is omitted. Or there might be a different picture on the news that is added to a voiceover. Or the voiceover says something completely different from what is being spoken. And you'll see this often, where there'll be a politician perhaps or someone else who is speaking at a podium or in front of a group, and you don't hear them, you hear the newscaster who tells you what they said. And then in your mind, you think that's what they said. And they may have said exactly the opposite. Well, where did this fake news start? Well, I suppose we could go all the way back to Genesis with fake news. But that's been a new term in the last couple of years. Well, I first ran into it, not using this term, but the whole concept that the news does not report what happened necessarily. I grew up in Madison, New Jersey. I was a teenager there in the 1960s. And that was a time when different cities were having riots, different things were going on. And in Madison, which was this quiet little burb of about 17,000 people where nothing much ever happened. The main street was Main Street. There was a movie theater. There were churches for every key denomination. It was just what you would expect Americana to be. I grew up in the golden age of America. You could walk to school, which I did when I was in first grade, and it was half a mile away. Uphill both ways in the snow, as you know.
30-mile-an-hour winds.
But yeah, that's right. But truthfully, I mean, it really was. My parents would today be arrested, and we would be taken from them. But we lived in safety. We lived in a different world. And so when the news came to town, at that point, CBS, NBC, not sure if ABC even existed then, Dumont Network, and they were there downtown. This was a big thing. And so the buzz went around high school that there were some news people downtown. Well, we walked downtown, it was about a mile, and there was a big crowd of people behind a yellow tape. Actually, at that point, it wasn't yellow tape. It was the sawhorses that they used. Behind the sawhorses, the police had cordoned it off, and they were all watching 5 or 6 Drew University students picketing a barbershop. Okay, and so we joined the crowd behind the cordoned off area. And it was a relatively small thing, but it made the news. And that night, we watched. Madison, New Jersey was going to be on the news. And so we turned on CBS and NBC and watched Walter Cronkite and watched Douglas Edwards with the news as they reported on Madison, New Jersey. And in both cases, they showed the crowds as if they were the protesters. So what was in essence a very, very, very minor thing had been added to the national consciousness. They were fomenting protest. I experienced it in Ghana when we were dealing with an airline there. I knew what had happened with the airline, but the papers painted it as if this airline was the wickedest, most evil group, that they had stolen from the people and the rest, and the truth was just the opposite. 2004, we all saw it with Dan Rather broadcasting an explosive report on the Air National Guard service of President George W. Bush. It was supposed to be the high point of Rather's career, like Woodward and Bernstein with Nixon. Instead, it proved to be false. it blew up in his face, tarnishing his career forever and casting a dark cloud of doubt and suspicion over all of his prior reporting. February 2015, anchorman Brian Williams, at that time perhaps the most trusted man in America, had apparently been exaggerating an anecdote about coming under fire in a U.S. Army helicopter during the Iraq War in 2003. And then it was discovered that there were other things that he had done and said that were not quite as accurate as that. Misreporting the news, lying in order to change people's minds. More recently, in fact, this just appeared in the paper January 7th of this year about something that happened last January in Washington. This headline, Covington, Kentucky. CNN agreed Tuesday to settle a lawsuit with Covington Catholic student Nick Sandmann. Remember him? He's the one who was there wearing the MAGA hat with a crowd of kids who were just coming to the march in Washington, the pro-life march in Washington, standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial waiting for a bus. And the video made it appear as if he was in some way taunting an Indian, a Native American Indian. Then the whole video came out, and you saw what was really going on, and that he was the victim. He was not the instigator. The amount of the settlement was not made public during a hearing at the federal courthouse in Covington, Kentucky. Sandmann's lawsuit saw $800 million from CNN, from the Washington Post and NBC Universal. The Washington Post suit sought $250 million. Did you hear the retraction? Not many people did. Because you see, people hear the false news and it's repeated over and over and over and over again. And then when a retraction is given, most people don't even know what it's talking about. And hence the lie continues on. And you speak to someone, and then when you talk to them, they may still think that that whole incident occurred as it was initially portrayed, which was an intentional misrepresentation of what occurred, just like those Madison barbershop riots. Well, the press is free, and they should be, because the press is the opportunity given to us to hear what is going on. It is the communication that you need when the government is controlling what you are thinking and what the message is that is going out, something we would typically call propaganda. Well, the First Amendment was given so that the government would stay honest, and so the people could know what was really going on. The First Amendment says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Listen to this from Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. No experiment can be more interesting than what we are now trying, and which we trust will end in establishing the fact that man may be governed by reason and truth. Our first object should therefore be to leave open to him all the avenues to truth. The most effectual hitherto found is the freedom of the press. It is therefore the first shut up by those who fear the investigation of their actions. Benjamin Franklin, himself a newspaper man, said this: whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech and the freedom of the press. Despots hate the truth that can come from a free press. Why should freedom of speech and freedom of press be allowed? You know who asked that question? Vladimir Lenin. And he continued on and he said this: why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons, Ideas are much more fatal than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government? Socialism at its root requires the suppression of the truth and the presentation of an alternative message. We'll go through, I'll share some other quotes with you today and some other situations that make that very clear. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was something of a dictator, would you say? Not a socialist, certainly. He said, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. Calvin Coolidge said this, wherever despotism abounds, the sources of public information are the first to be brought under its control. Wherever the cause of liberty is making its way, one of its highest accomplishments is the guarantee of the freedom of the press. So we need and we want the press to be free, to give any opinion, those with which we agree and those with which we disagree. Labeling speech hate speech, which is a recent tactic, squelches truth. There was a UN resolution that would have made criticism of Islam a crime. And there are people who have been charged with criminal actions in the United Kingdom of all places for hate speech, things they said. Then here on our own college campuses, there are speech codes. There are things you can't say. You can't say in class, and you can't say out of specific zones on the campus. Kirk Cameron said this, I should be able to express moral views on social issues without being slandered, without being accused of hate speech, without being told from those who preach tolerance that I need to either bend my beliefs to their moral standards or be silent when I'm in the public square. But that is what is happening. We call it political correctness. Political correctness is a polite term for shutting down your freedoms, specifically your freedom to speak, but it goes well beyond that. Mark Potok wrote, one man's hate speech is another man's poetry. Hate speech is in the ear of the beholder. And that is really where the challenge is. You can't designate something hate speech just because you disagree with it. And beyond that, even when you get to hate crimes, is somebody more dead because the motive of the person who killed them was hateful because of their whatever it is that's unique to them? George Orwell spoke thusly, freedom of the press, if it means anything at all, means the freedom to criticize and oppose. Okay, that you have to have that within a free society. You have to have the truth coming to you from multiple avenues so that you can judge for yourself what is true, what is not true. Franklin Roosevelt said this, there is a difference between freedom and license. Editorialists who tell downright lies in order to advance their own agendas do more to discredit the press than all the censors in the world. Well, that is what we're seeing right now. The price of fake news is a discredited press, which will ultimately lead to not hearing news that is trustworthy at all. Well, God has an antidote. The purpose of the 10 Commandments was to enable a people to live in a society that could flourish. There are many who think the 10 Commandments were given in order to provide a pathway to salvation. Absolutely not. Total impossibility. We read in the New Testament, if somebody breaks one law, he's a lawbreaker and has broken them all. It only takes one. God is looking for perfection. If you want to be acceptable to God on your own, based on your own works. Just be perfect. That's all.
Yeah.
The only problem is we don't have that within our being to be perfect. Why then were they given? Exodus 15:26. God speaks. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. So one of the reasons was so the people wouldn't get the sicknesses that others had. Do you know, during the plague, Jews generally did not get the plague. In fact, it was so striking that they didn't get the plague that the presumption on the part of the Gentiles was that this was a curse from the Jews. You know why they didn't get the plague? Because they buried their dead the same day. If somebody touched a dead person, they were quarantined for several days. They washed their hands before eating. They had any number of other things that were given to them by God as do this, don't do this, that were intended to preserve them from disease. But then beyond that, the commandments generally were to enable a society to exist, people to live together in harmony. Joshua 1. You shall therefore keep every commandment I am giving you today, so that you may have the strength to go in and possess the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, and so that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them and their descendants. So the commands are given so that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them and their descendants. But be careful, he says, that you are not enticed to turn aside to worship and bow down to other gods, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut the heavens so that there will be no rain, nor will the land yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is giving you. What he makes clear as well, and he uses these words, that if you keep these laws, you will live and prosper in the land. If you do not, the land itself will vomit you out. Well, you think about the 10 Commandments. If people aren't bearing false witness, if they're not coveting their neighbor's goods and their neighbor's wife, if they start out with loving their neighbor as they love themselves, boy, that's a place I'd like to live. Because you're building a society. You have trust at its heart. Truth is vital for the functioning of any society. In Leviticus 20, in verse 22, you are therefore to keep all my statutes and ordinances so that the land where I'm bringing you to live will not vomit you out. You must not follow the statutes of the nations I am driving out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. Well, truth. You know, justice requires truth. And it's important in any society that you have justice. But false testimonies destroy justice because they destroy the truth. So there's an auto accident on the corner. It's the next day. How do you find out what happened? Well, one person comes and says, he cut me off. The other person comes and says, I did not. You jammed on your brakes, you swerved, you hit me. Who's telling the truth? Well, you need eyewitnesses. You need them to tell you. Well, one eyewitness comes forward and they support the story of one. And then you find out, well, that is her sister. And there is no corroboration. And then you find two observers who tell you exactly what happened, and they happen to agree, and they don't know one another, by the way. So it's not one who told the other, this is what I saw. Rather, what you need, according to the scriptures, is 2 or more witnesses. People are generally rational. Give them good facts, and they will make good decisions. Giving them lies is like throwing a Molotov cocktail into a lunchroom. James 3:6 says, the tongue is a fire. People will say things that inflame others. It is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body and sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. I think men actually do better with words in some regard. Men speak about 1/4 as many words and remember about 1/10 as many as their wife. It's true, if you want to investigate, you'll find out that testosterone gives you short-term memory. Estrogen gives you long-term memory. Some of you may have wives who remember what happened when you were dating in high school. Yes. And they may have brought it up a few times since then. This is not politically correct, by the way. But a little something said is out there. And once it's out there, it's out there. And today on the internet, it's out there forever. You may be 50 years gone to glory, dead. And what you said is still out there for somebody to see. So, how can you distinguish the truth from fake news? Oh, I know. Let's go to Snopes.com. If I asked for people to raise hands, I think I would discover that virtually everybody here has looked at Snopes. Or you've had an email sent to you that said, Snopes fact-checked this, and it's true, or it's not. You go to the Snopes.com website, and it says, welcome to Snopes.com, the definitive internet reference source for urban legends, folklore, myths, rumors, and misinformation. Barbara and David Mickelson. Well, we have fact checkers now, but who checks the fact checkers? Well, I'm going to do a little check on the fact checkers this morning. Daily Mail, December 22nd, 2016, reported this. It was announced last week that Snopes would be helping Facebook to determine and label fake news. So when you use Facebook, their fake news checker is, in fact, Snopes. And they're going to do that with the help of ABC News and PolitiFact, another fact checker. The Daily Mail reports that the CEO of Snopes, David Mickelson, is currently embroiled in a vicious legal battle with his former wife and Snopes co-founder, Barbara Mickelson. The couple divorced sometime around 2014, but legal proceedings have continued between the couple. Barbara Mickelson claims David embezzled $98,000. And then he spent it on prostitutes. Do you see any issue with truth and integrity in any of this? According to the Daily Mail, David has remarried since his divorce from Barbara in 2014. His current wife, Alyssa Young, works as an administrative worker at Snopes, but she previously had a lengthy career as an escort and adult film star working under the name Erin O'Brien. You cannot make this up. Okay, this is what America is trusting as the ultimate source of truth. Take the Bible, stick it on the bookshelf, or get it out of the house and get it out of the schools. But we'll check on Snopes because they're going to tell us the truth. Well, if the Daily Mail is accurate, we may want to just make sure we bring the Bible back and trust that. Mickelson has previously stated that Snopes does not take any political positions whatsoever. His current wife, however, has a history in politics. The Daily Mail reports that Young ran for the U.S. Congress in Hawaii on the Libertarian ticket in 2004, during which time she distributed cards that read, "Re-defeat Bush," and condoms with the words, "Don't get screwed again," printed on the wrapping. On her campaign website, Young outright stated, let's face it, because, quote, "I am an unlikely candidate. I fully admit that I am a courtesan." Selling herself for sensual pleasures for others. Young's campaign, however, was unsuccessful, and she lost to the incumbent. Speaking to the Daily Mail, David Mickelson stated that Snopes did not have a standardized procedure for fact-checking. Since, quote, "the nature of this material can vary widely," he also stated that the process, quote, "involves multiple stages of editorial oversight, so no output is the result of a single person's discretion," unquote. When asked about the requirements for becoming an employee of Snopes, Mickelson stated, accordingly, our editorial staff is drawn from diverse backgrounds. Some have degrees and/or professional experience in journalism, and some of them don't. Also, according to the Daily Mail, another one of Snopes' lead fact-checkers has a history of sex blogging, writing under the pseudonym Vice Vixen. Okay, now this is funny, except it's tragic. Yes. We have a whole society being guided based upon the fact-checking of Vice Vixen. Okay, it's funny, but it's sad. Okay, so how do you find out the truth? Well, there's a scientific method. The only problem is it doesn't work with regards to events in human history, because the scientific method is repeatability. And what we deal with is, really, we're dealing just with one-time events. Something happened. It's not reproducible. It's not repeatable. It happened once. The scientific method can prove whether or not cold fusion really exists by attempting to repeat it elsewhere. So what do we use? Well, we use a historical method of testimony. Actually, it's exactly what you find in the scriptures. The testimony of two or more eyewitnesses establishes the truth. Matthew 18:16 says, but if he will not listen, speaking about going to an elder who has done something, or someone in the church who has done something questionable, if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that, and then it quotes from the Old Testament, every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. If you don't have two or three witnesses, the scriptures teach you cannot take any action, because you don't know what happened. It's he said, she said, and so on. You don't know. Therefore, it is in the province of God to mete out the justice in such a situation. 1 Timothy 5:19 says, do not entertain an accusation against an elder except on the testimony of two or three witnesses. Again, if you don't have two or three witnesses, you don't know what happened. You don't know what the truth is. You may think because such and such a person claims this person did this evil deed 3 years ago, and then another person comes forward and says, this person did the same thing to me, that you have corroborating testimony. You do not. Think about Brett Kavanaugh. You could have 20 women come forward and say something that happened to them as individuals. None is a corroborating witness for any of the others. The American public, however, has been tricked into believing that corroboration exists because of the seriousness of the charge made by two or more witnesses about their individual situations. I don't know what happened. God alone knows what happened. But we can take no action if there is only a single witness to a single event. Deuteronomy 19:15 says, a lone witness is not sufficient to establish any wrongdoing or sin against a man, regardless of what offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. Numbers 35:30 says this, if anyone kills a person, the murderer is to be put to death on the testimony of multiple witnesses, but no one is to be put to death based on the testimony of a lone witness. Jesus knew about false witnesses. Matthew 26, now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking false testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death. But they didn't find any, though there were many false witnesses that came forward. In other words, they couldn't find corroborating witnesses to any of the testimonies given by any of the witnesses. And Jesus ultimately said, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. At this, the high priest tore his clothes and declared, he has blasphemed. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy for yourselves. What do you think? He deserves to die, they answered. Well, you can read chapters before that where they had already made the decision that he was going to die. They arrived at the conclusion, even though they could not find corroborating witnesses. They sought facts only to justify their conclusion. People who seek power will distort the truth and promote lies, just as the Pharisees did in that situation. Propaganda, fake news, spin. Oh, you weren't there. You didn't hear the whole day of testimonies by so many different people, whether it's the impeachment trial or pick whatever you choose. Well, you'll hear some talking heads tell you what was said. And many people will go away believing that that's exactly what happened. Spin. Censorship. Ridicule. Ridicule is perhaps the most effective. Somebody says something, it's absolutely true, but they're mocked for what they say. And therefore, what they say is not believed. Socialism seeks to divide by sowing hatred with false news. Stories change minds. Pictures change minds. I had a course in college called Mass Communication. It was taught by the president of Channel 13. And we just saw videos, read books, not that, well, I guess you call them videos. There were movies back then. Okay, read books, listened to taped radio broadcasts, and so on. And listened to it to understand what the intention was of the people who had put together the movie, who had put together the story, and what the feelings were and the senses and what your conclusions were after you had gone through. And it was quite interesting. We saw a showing of Birth of a Nation, a black and white silent film. It was a promotional for the Ku Klux Klan. It actually was shown in the White House by Woodrow Wilson. True story. And really led to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. When you see the movie, you understand why. By the end of the movie, everybody is cheering for these white-sheeted guys. Because the movie makes an argument that subtly transitions you from one position to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. And unless you're approaching these things critically, you can easily be sucked in. Videos change minds. How many people saw that video of Nick Sandman standing there with Nathan Phillips and thought, wow, what an arrogant, punky little kid. And then you see the whole thing and you discover these guys were saints. If I had been standing there, I would have punched a few people. I hesitate to share that with you.
It'll be on YouTube.
Well, they want a retraction from CNN, but nobody reads the retraction. Nobody listens. Nobody hears. And it's not played over and over and over again. Sometimes the impact is so great that a war is lost. The reporting on the Tet Offensive was that we had lost this big battle. We had been surprised we'd lost. The reality is we won. It was an overwhelming victory for America, for our army over there, our military. But the people, because of the reporting on the news, thought we had lost. And public opinion turned even more against the war.